So I will start the meeting now. So welcome everyone. Thank you for those who are returning to our second dialogue was with us last week, and those new of you, please welcome. I also welcome our panelists and from UNICEF and ATRA Somalia. Thank you so much for joining us. We also have children who will be joining us from Mogadishu. I think your camera is coming. So, well, my name is Ayan. My name is Ayan Mohammed. I work for Save the Children as a policy and advocacy manager, and I will be your moderator for this call. Kindly, can I request you to mute your mics so we are able to hear everyone in the call and we manage the time well. Please mute your mics except if you are speaking. And our panelists, I request you to turn on your cameras and mute your mics. Thank you. So before I give you any introduction on this discussion today, I want to give you a brief background on the call. Will be 1 hour and 30 minutes maximum. We will have we have both public and also organizations joining us, and also the government's people who are education experts, policymakers, and also the general public, youth groups, and also children themselves are on this call. I would like to tell you that this meeting is recorded, so your questions and anything discussed in this meeting will be available on YouTube. You can visit anytime and rewatch it again. You do not need to record this meeting, so we will be recording for you. We have 4 panelists and 2 children who will be leading on our discussion today, and I will be your moderator. You will be putting your questions on the chat box. We only allow panelists to speak and the children, and I will apologize for that, for just to manage on the discussion. So if you have any questions or you have a specific question to our panelists during the presentation, each panelist will make a presentation maximum 7 minutes, minimum 5 minutes. You can add your questions to the chat box. So by the time we finish, we will have your questions addressed, hopefully. So just to give you a bit of a background where we are doing this webinar, to Save the Children is, according to the statistics available in the country, children are out of school due to coronavirus, and we need to actually see how to make sure that children education is not disrupted and children continue learning despite of the challenge of the pandemic. So early 2020, Somalia Education Cluster has made an assessment on the number of children that are out of school across the country. 3 million children are out of school at the beginning of this year, according to the statistics. So now, after the coronavirus, another 1 million has, been added to that number. So now we have 4 million children out of school across the country. So now we know the impact that had on children. So it's really important that today we discuss on that. So we have 4 million children across Somalia that are out of school due to the pandemic. This one of the challenges faced everywhere, and also in Somalia and Somaliland, is how do we deliver education in this difficult time and also in a difficult system, and also how to make sure that children continue learning in the lockdowns, and also what alternative means that we can deliver education to children, especially children who are now in grade 8 and also grade 12, also who are on their exams. How we make sure that these children also finish their exams on time. Also, we know that there's a lack of clarity on how COVID-19 situation will develop. We don't know if the virus will be here more time. We don't know how long that will be. There's no vaccine yet. So it's necessary that we discuss on how to make sure that the education continues no matter what, and the sector start putting, long-term measures or methodologies to ensure that children continue learning, even if the schools are closed a long time or schools are open in a short time. So we need to ensure that no matter what happens, education continues, and we need to come up with a new ways of learning, new ways, innovative ways to ensure that children are not left behind and education is not disrupted. And that's with the support of the different education stakeholders, international organizations, the country, and also with the UN. We want to make sure that the government receives enough support to continue this, and also the government puts this agenda into the national on state efforts. So in order to address all these challenges that are facing on education in Somalia and Somaliland, we have created this platform to ensure that we provide our education experts in the sector, both from international organizations and UN organizations, opportunity to actually discuss how can we come together to ensure we come up with a very concrete policy and programmatic solutions to minimize the impact of coronavirus on children, and also to make sure that the children continue learning no matter where they are. For those of you who were here last week, every other week we organize a webinar on the impact of COVID-19 on children. Each 2 weeks we choose a different topic to discuss, and that we see as a priority for the public and also for the government to address in order to make sure that we don't forget the children in these difficult times. So today we want to bring the public attention to the pressing needs for children in Somalia, and also to the government. So we're better able to put concrete measures in place that allows children to continue their education during COVID-19, and also ensure children are the center of state and national efforts, as I said before. So in this dialogue, it's important that we discuss and also listen to our experts, and also listen to the children. Together, how can we address the challenge in education, and also talk about what is needed to deliver right now for the children, especially children in remote areas who have already had a challenge to access education. What does this mean for them now? And also talk about how do we continue education, and also come up with a new learning and system adaptation of the challenge. How can we adapt in this difficult, crisis, and make sure that we come up with a new innovative ways that we can deliver this to our children. So today, I want to introduce you to our panelists, and also the children who will be with us today to talk about the challenge and everything that I've just said. So we have two children representatives joining us from Mogadishu, Somalia. We have Sharmake Ma'ali Mohammed, who is 16 years old, and also Halimo Aden Mohammed, who is 17 years old. These two children will talk about how coronavirus has impacted their education, what are their worries, and what do they want us as stakeholders to ensure that we prioritize for children, because the children knows the issues better than we know the issues. So it's important that we listen to what they say, and we prioritize what they see as a priority in these difficult times. We also have Mingisto, Save the Children Somalia and Somaliland Head of Education, who will address and talk about, who will give us a brief overview on how children are impacted in this pandemic, and how overall education in Somalia is right now. We also have Mrs. Tong from UNICEF Somalia Chief of Education, who will also talk about the closure of schools and its impact on ongoing to children in Somalia. With very important topic to talk about. Schools are closed, how the children are affected. And also we have Dr. Vaiza Hassan, who's joining us from, who's a program director for Save the Children at Care International. Faiza will give us a brief overview or an expert eye on continuity of education and how can we come up with new ways to deliver education to children also in remote areas and also who are in a lockdown. And will these learning alternatives, will they work in Somalia? In this context, it's also important we know that whatever ways we are coming up with, will it work in this context? And finally, we will have Sam from Adra Somalia, who will give us an update on schools. Are we ready to, if the coronavirus ends very soon or not? Are the schools ready to reopen in post-COVID in Somalia? And how would that happen? And if it happens, how can we better ensure that children go back to school in a meaningful way? So now I would like to give you Mengistu, our Save the Children Head of Education, to give us an overview on the impact of COVID-19 on education. Please welcome Mengistu. Please tell us now how the education sector is.
Thank you, Ayan. COVID-19, there is no children's right that is not impacted or affected by COVID-19. Children's right to survival, children's right to learning, children's right to protection, and children's right to have a balanced diet is all affected by COVID-19. Education is globally under a crisis. Out of school children who are enrolled in school and not learning are more than the number of children who are out of school. COVID-19 has made this situation more worse by making schools close all over the world. In Somalia, since March, schools are closed and children are sent back home in their communities. An environment which is completely have a different setup than school. When children are at home, they are more with the feeling of being a holiday, mixing with, playing with their siblings, their village, neighbors, and the like. Not motivated for learning. The environment does not encourage children for learning and doesn't give opportunity for children for learning. So it is highly unlikely that children learn at home with the school closure. Despite this, the government of Somalia, Somaliland, has developed a very comprehensive response plan that could support children continue their learning during the school's closure, with both online and offline opportunities and forums. The online one can only serve those children who can afford to have the smartphone or a computer or a capacity or ability to buy airtime to fill their mobiles and access the internet, and also where internets are available. This for sure will marginalize those already marginalized rural children, poor children from the poor family, and children in IDPs, as well as also children with disabilities. The government not only used online, but also has tried to make offline, like TV, radios, and the like, and also print medias. Still, children in a family that do not have TV or radio cannot access their learning. Not only from those families, but there are children living in deep remote areas where TV coverage and radio coverage cannot reach. So those children are highly marginalized and their education is at risk. And it's highly unlikely also that these children are learning. The government is also trying to purchase solar panels, solar radios, and MP3s, and also trying to get print materials to distribute to areas where these gadgets or technologies cannot reach. A very good step, but it is really uncertain how far the distribution can reach those children still deep in the rural areas and IDPs, and how that will benefit also the children with disabilities. These online, offline gadgets can serve only, cannot replace at all a teacher. They can only serve in complementing teachers' actions, teachers' activity. But in the absence of teacher, in a society like that of Somalia, a very traditional society, and where there is no support at home, I really doubt this approach will effectively support children's learning. So the environment is really difficult. The system that we are trying to reach children is new, and the community is not ready, and no one, including the Ministry of Education and all of the development partners, are not ready for this. That is why the impact of COVID is more serious than it should have happened. This technology should have happened during a normal learning times. Moreover, children are also sitting for the national exams. They are not sure when the exams are coming, and they are at home within the village with the community. No teacher to support them, to help them review their subjects. So the chance of them being prepared for this exam is either no or very, very limited. And it is really unfortunate that these children will demonstrate their performance well. And the data that we can get from our exam result, I doubt will tell us the exact competency of our children. Even when schools are to be opened, now the school setup will completely change. New environment. Because of physical distancing, because of making facilities for hand wash, because of protecting self and protecting others. So the school environment, which even when school opened, will really require a huge task for preparation. Make our school really safe for children to attend. More than this, last panel discussion has clearly indicated how COVID impact has also impacted the right of children to protection. I don't want to go into details because it has been discussed in the last dialogue panels, but all reports, all discussions, all observations indicate that children's violence, uh, children's abuse has increased. Early marriage has increased, FGM has increased, physical harassment, punishment, physical abuse has increased. This all has really an impact, direct impact on their learning, not indirect, but a direct impact on their learning. While the school was open, children, even though not all, few of them do also have access to school feeding. Now, when they are at home, school feeding will completely stop. With the COVID impact of restrictions, the economy has gone down. The income of household has gone down. Now, it's really difficult to think that children at home are getting the proper food, the proper meal, which again has a very direct impact on their learning. Children can only learn when they have a well-balanced diet, at least proper meal. Now being at home again, COVID has, children has really been exposed to COVID pandemic. One, in the traditional Somali society, where socialization is highly valued, people sit together, eat together, play together, and walk out together, and there are open markets with no chance giving for the children for the precaution of all World Health Organization of distancing. Even the rural part of Somalia also, leave alone water for washing, which COVID requires a frequent hand wash with a soap. Even water for drinking is very rare and limited. So these children cannot really observe all those prevention mechanisms of washing hands, keeping distance, and the like. So this will expose them fully to COVID-19, which has impact on their right to survival. All the team that I have discussed with, the education team, tell me that children are still out in the field, playing, running after small balls. Imagine, with this very difficult situation, even with the most careful that we are, cannot control this COVID pandemic, being exposed to those social, even social activities, social things, will put our children under a risk of survival. So the impact of COVID is not one, two, or three, it's circle, it's a square. So it's really difficult to find out a way to get out of this circle of this square at this very difficult time. Let me stop here and then give the opportunity for the other panelists who will go in detail to all the other impacts area with this background. Thank you, Ayan.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mengistu. Now I would like to give the floor to Mrs. Tong from UNICEF, Chief of Education, to talk about the impact closure of schools had on children. Welcome, Ms. Tong. Your mic is on mute, so.
Everyone, thank you, Ayan. Thank you very thank you, Mengistu, for really setting the stage for us. I'd like to take the next few minutes with everyone here, and I'm really excited to see the two young persons here with us as well. My discussion will be really about the impact on education and certainly on children, school-age children throughout Somalia, Somaliland. Ayan, would you like to run the presentation?
Yep.
Yes. So I have a very short presentation to share with you all today. And I think by now we're all very much aware that we have over 1.5 billion children and youth throughout the world who are missing out on education due to school closure. Here, closer to home where we are looking at over 1.2 million school-age children, school-enrolled registered children who are not receiving education at this time. We're also, the COVID-19 is also impacting on the teachers and their ability to support students. And that's about 27,000 teachers who are also impacted by the current coronavirus. I think Mengistu mentioned quite a little bit about the impact already, but let me just share with you a few more additional points. We are right now not only experiencing but also the impact of the floods as well as the locust infestation, what we call the triple threat. the progress in terms of education progress we've achieved in the last few decades now at risk of rolling back, which is a huge challenge for us. Again, I mentioned about 1.57,000 teachers affected, and children who were marginalized before the COVID-19 pandemic due to their gender, their abilities, poverty, localities, whether they are in rural or urban areas, whether they are pastoralists or agro-pastoralists.
It's breaking.
Hello. I think it's a technical problem.
Is it from my side or is breaking for
no,
all of you?
it's from Mr. Song's side. I think it's the internet problem. We can't hear you actually. Yeah, your mic is on mute again, so let me. Yeah, try again.
Down. Okay.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
You.
All right.
Yeah.
So as I was saying, that children who are marginalized before the COVID pandemic due to their gender, their abilities, their poverty status, their localities, their movement, whether they are IDPs or refugees or returnees, and other lines of division, if they were at risk before, they are now more at risk than ever. In terms of inaccessibility and inequity to access to distance learning, we were talking about, distance learning, TV, radio, internet, mobile phone. Children, this is now even further compounded. And so, as I mentioned before, the needs and marginalization of children who were vulnerable before is now further compounded. I'd like to take you to the next slide, which is to talk about the secondary impact of the COVID-19. And so the type of services that have been provided in schools before, whether it be child protection, nutritious school feeding, safe water and sanitation, safe and protective learning environment, gender-based violence awareness, skills development, all of these things that were facilities are no longer available. We also are now seeing increased exploitation and violations against children. Teenage pregnancy, early forced marriage, child labor, FGM, child labor, domestic chores, abuse, psychosocial. Now we're seeing huge increase in this. The lockdown means also the confining of children with their abusers where abuse was taking place within the home before. Now this is a bigger challenge, and children are struggling with stress and depression. As I mentioned, to distance learning, even more vulnerable, the social exclusion, the social political risk, and children have a higher propensity for negative coping mechanisms and behaviors. I want to draw your attention to the graph to the left, and that's to say these we did related a type of protection risks that children are now facing as a result of the COVID-19. And we see that there is huge sexual gender-based violence, physical violence is also up, and emotional abuse that children are facing, both inside the home as well as outside the home. Next, please. Next slide. And we also see that during this, the impact of the COVID-19 has between. We also see that there are different impacts. We know that due to the restrictions, the physical risk and the social distancing and so forth, that 40% of children who are at home are actually not staying at home. They are running around in the community, lack of activities. And again, this is the opportunity for a lot of challenges that they're experiencing in terms of violations and abuse. Children who are living in IDP camps cannot observe this physical distancing. There's just simply not enough space. and that 43% of children are at home, and 16% are having some type of learning. But again, for that learning to take place, it means that they have to have electricity, they have to have access to a mobile phone or online or radio and so forth. So the chart that you see on your right now, this is how children are spending their time. As I mentioned, some are staying at home, others are working on the street to actually gain additional income for their families during this very difficult economic situation. Children are also, the 16%, which is not very high, are accessing some type of distance learning. Others are playing games, and quite a lot are actually idling.
Mr. Tong, we are actually breaking. We can't actually hear you. Apology for the technical problem. Let me try to fix it again. We can't hear you. Then, okay. Can you unmute yourselves again? Sorry. Ms. Tong, can you hear us? Apology, I think that's a technical problem. If you can hear us, please unmute yourself. Yes, unfortunately, there's a technical problem that is not in our hands. We'll get back to Ms. Tong, but now to take advantage of time, I would like to give to the children to talk to us while Tong's coming back. So, Halimo, mana maqlaysaa? Halimo is microphone furo. Hi, makaan ku maqlaynaa.
Hello.
Hi, soo dhawow.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Oh, now you are
now
back.
We can hear you.
Okay,
Yeah.
I really apologize for my poor internet connectivity.
No problem. So we gave the opportunity to the children to speak to us while you were away.
Okay, so, thank you. The children always save the day.
Yes. So Halimo, wax yar baad na sugaysaa, ya? Naga raaliho. So you continue, then we come back to Halimo.
Okay, wonderful. Okay. I just have 3 more slides. If you can change the next slide. So as I mentioned before, we are children, girls and boys are experiencing the impact very differently. So the next slide, please. So we're finding that in terms of the impact on girls, in our survey, quite a large majority are now experiencing the higher risk of sexual exploitation and abuse. And more likely than not, when schools do reopen, we will see that there will be less girls re-enrolling back into school. You know, as I mentioned before, the child labor, the exploitation, abuse, emotional stress, and the dropout eventually, when schools do resume, girls will be less likely if they're facing abuse and neglect at this time, or you know, put into early or forced marriage, they're much less likely to return to schooling. And the exploitation in terms of their sexual exploitation very much on the rise at this time. In terms of boys, on the next slide, we see that there is more engagement in the streets life. We also see that more boys are likely to join some type of child labor activities that is very much exploiting them further. And they're also involved in petty crimes such as mobile phone theft, They're also more likely to face more violence, crime, and conflict. And finally, in terms of the risk of recruitment and abduction, that is about 12% of all the boys that we are speaking to. So you can see that the impact on boys and girls are quite different, but nonetheless, huge exploitation of them while we're going through this COVID-19 situation. In terms of my next slide, I'm just going to talk about some of the opportunities moving forward in the next slide. I think we can capitalize on some key areas, such as trying to accelerate our very nascent support on early childhood education and preparing these young children to actually enter into school. I think we need to really emphasize and go back to the basic reading, writing, arithmetic skills to prepare these young children. Again, if we have a learning, as I mentioned before, there is a learning crisis before the COVID-19, and all the achievements we've made to date may be rolled back if we don't really emphasize support on the basic foundational of reading, writing, arithmetic in the early grades. We also need to support teachers. These teachers are basically the conductor in an orchestra, let's say, and we need to strengthen their capacity to advocate and support for their equitable, access to training, particularly around COVID-19 prevention, particularly around psychosocial first aid supports. And I think we also need to strengthen flexible and alternative education pathways targeting out-of-school children. This is an opportunity. If we're looking at supporting distance learning, let's take this opportunity to really cater to the large 3 million children out of school across the country. We need to scale up those distance learning opportunity for these children. And we also need to promote inclusive, gender responsive, but more than gender responsiveness, to make it gender transformative for girls and boys and for teachers, male and female. And we also need to focus on life skills for children and skills that can be transferred from one, education pathway to another. And in terms of development in their future with employment opportunities, I think we really need to target skills development for young people. And I will leave it right there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Trunk. I think that was really comprehensive presentation for us to understand how the coronavirus has impacted the children. So now I think this is the perfect time. We need to hear from the children who are the ones that are impacted on this crisis. So now I would like to welcome Halima and also Sharmake. Both of them are coming talking to us from Mogadishu. So Halima and Sharmake will be telling us, how this is affecting their, their lives and their education. Halima, may maqlaysaa? Kuma maqlayna weli? Halima, kuma maqlayna weli? Microphone-ka furo. Sharmake, may maqlaysaa adigu? Halima, we all have internet technical problems somewhere. Unfortunately, that's a challenge we cannot fix. Microphone-ka ma furan kartaa, Halimoy? Haye, kamaradana isku soo dhawee. Si aan wejigaaga oo aragno codkaagana oo maqalna. Halima, soo dhawow. Microphone-ka furo. Haye. Si wanaagsan. Halimoy, bal waxaad noo sheegtaa intii xanuunkan muxuu ahaaye corona yimiday iskuuladii la wada xidhay, saamayn intee leeg buu adiga iyo carruurtii kaleed wax wada baranayseen bay idinku yeeshay?
Saamayn aad iyo aad weyn ayay ku yeeshay carruurta Soomaaliyeed.
يا امسك في عمك ومقلنا يمك هي صعب
saamaynta uu ku yeeshay COVID-19 carruurta Soomaaliyeed iyo dhankeedaba aad iyo aad ayay u fara badan tahay balse lama soo koobi karo.
kamarada waad iska xiri kartaa si codku kugu hagaago weli kuma maqlayno waxaan u malaynayaa sharmaake iyo xaliimo waa isku dhowdihiin markastoo isku dhowdihiin codku uu xumaanaya hal computer ma wada isticmaali kartaa ay hal computer wada isticmaala aye sharmaako ma maqlaysaa adigu hal computer wada isticmaala mid iska xidha mid kaliya wada isticmaala aye sharmaako soo dhawow aye bal noo sheeg iskuuladii la xidhay iyo saamayntii ku yeeshay inta xalimo qaabka loo hagaajinayo I think that's a technical problem with the internet. labadiina ma idin maqlayo ima iyo sharmaake so I think while the team is supporting them to solve the technical problem, I will come back to I'll come back to the children. So I will go straight to the next panelist so we have a better time. Sharmaake iyo Halima waan idin soo laabanaya microphone-ka la idin hagaajiyo. Okay. Right. So now please mute your mics. Microphone-adana iska xidha. So now I would like to welcome for the sake of time, I would like to welcome Dr. Faisa Hassan, who's a education program director for Save the Children and Care Joint Consortium program, to talk about the continuity of education and also, the alternative distance learning pathways and if they will work in Somali context. Dr. Faisa, please welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ayan. Okay, can you put up the presentation, please?
Yep. Okay.
Thanks, Ayan. Okay, so then continuity of education and alternative distance learning pathways, specifically in the Somali context. Okay, Ayan, you can go to the next slide. So basically, we've seen, I don't need to mention, but this pandemic has really caused disruptions to all of our normal lives, and education has been no exception to that. And with so many children out of school at the same time, we've seen around the world, all countries have rushed to try to fill this void with distance learning solutions. And, these solutions have ranged from high-tech alternatives like real-time video classes done remotely to lower tech options, such as, educational programming on radio and television, and then no tech options at all, like the provision of printed materials for home-based study. So then almost overnight, all of us working in the sector had to consider making a massive shift from the formal education setting, from the formal school setting to digital and distance learning alternatives. And of course, none of us was prepared for that. And there was a necessity for speed in this transition, which meant that, of course, the process has been not perfect, and we've had to improve as we went along. So then as we worked on this transition over the past couple of months across the education sector, there was many things that all of us had to consider, especially in our context. The number one was the technological readiness, and key questions we had to ask ourselves was, do students or teachers have access to internet connectivity? Do they have access to computers or smartphones? How many households have access to electricity, television or radio devices? Innovation through technology is only feasible if the technological readiness is there on the ground to begin with. And then the second thing to consider was, how about the content readiness? Do we have, teaching and learning materials that could be delivered through the online platforms, TV or radio programming? And then how about the pedagogical readiness? Where are teachers prepared to facilitate online or TV-based distance learning? Because key to the success in making this shift is not only to train and support our teachers, but also to make sure that they're engaged and ready to design those distance learning platforms. So then also to add to that is not just teachers, but how about the parents? Are parents available or ready or able to facilitate home-based learning for their children? Are they able to monitor daily learning of their children in the home setting? And then, additional things to consider over the last couple of months as we've worked on trying to make this shift and transition was, how about the monitoring and evaluation readiness? Are we able to monitor and track access to the courses? How about the engagement? Are we able to assess learning outcomes? Of course, we know that innovation alone doesn't always represent quality in learning. And then, with things like shifting to TV or radio programs, these are one-way knowledge transmission systems. So then it's even more difficult to measure the extent to which students or even teachers are engaged in the process. And then on top of all these, considerations to make, an additional thing was, are we reinforcing existing social inequalities? Are we designing learning systems that then further exclude certain children? How about children with disabilities? How about children with no access to technology? So basically, the last couple of months, COVID has really forced all of us to think about making a massive shift to alternative learning pathways. It was really not an option. But for this shift to succeed in any context, it really needs to build on the locally available infrastructure and services. So we do need to keep consideration of what is feasible and what can reach students and teachers in a context like ours. So Ayan, if you go to the next slide. So then moving to specifically the Somali context, my colleagues Fung and Mengistu have already touched on this, but we know that even before COVID-19, millions of Somali children were already out of school and had no access to education. And, a lot more were at the risk of dropping out anyway from classrooms. And we know that our enrollment nationwide is, I think, is at 32 or 33%, if I'm not mistaken, which means that the vast majority of Somali children were already out of school even before COVID came along. So we had a bit of a complicated situation, and just COVID-19 made it even more difficult for all of us working in the sector. And schools have been closed since March. So then since March to now, the government has pulled all of its partners together, and we've all been working on designing these options. So then in the end, we've said in a context like ours, we do need to adopt a mixed approach to make sure that we can reach as many children as possible. So the government is currently working on developing an online e-learning platform where students can access all content from grades 1 to 12. The ministry is also at the moment working on developing pre-recorded radio and television lessons for children. And then in parallel to that, for children who have no access to either, the internet or radio and television devices, the government plans to distribute printed materials to make sure that they can continue learning at home. Obviously, this distance learning context is based on the national curriculum, and basically what the government is doing is producing a variation of the same content for dissemination across the different channels and platforms to be able to reach as many children as possible. So then in terms of equity considerations, there are plans to make sure that a certain portion of the printed material at least is in Braille for children with visual impairment. And we're also working on adapting the distance learning platforms, in particular the online and the television ones, with speech-to-text options to make sure that children with hearing impairment are reached. So in summary, I mean, this situation has forced all of us to come up with new solutions, and the government and its partners are trying their best to cope with this in the sector. But we also do need to remain realistic on what is possible. And then to add a final point to this is that there's also now in parallel, there's plans for the reopening of schools. So we're working on two things. That is the reopening of schools in August, but also the continued development of these distance learning alternative options. And now our approach is more of seeing this as a long-term investment that can then be used for any future emergency beyond COVID-19. So, okay, Ayaan, you can go to the next slide. So then just to end there, what next then for us? Like I said, now we're looking at this more as a long-term investment rather than a short-term, emergency thing. And at least we have time now to think of comprehensive distance learning strategies that can guide both the immediate needs and the longer-term goals. In the short term, of course, we need to make sure that children maintain access to learning and that they retain the skills and knowledge that they've gained. On a global level, this shift from the physical provision of education to distance learning alternatives does give us some opportunities to experiment with different possible models that can be relevant for the future of education. So in the long term, we're looking beyond this current crisis to try to learn lessons that may lay the foundation for more flexible education systems. That's it for me, really.
Ayaan, you're on mute.
Sorry. So thank you so much, Faisal, for giving us such an idea on if these alternative pathways are working in Somali context and what we need to, consider these inequalities that are already existing, and also if these methodologies are actually working. So now I would like to give the final panelists before I go to the children. So on post-COVID-19, what will happen? Are schools ready to open? And also, are we as an education stakeholders ready for that opening? So now I give you Sam from ADRA Somalia, Head of Education. Sam, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ayaan. Good morning, panelists, fellow panelists. Good morning, all participants. Ayaan, do you mind bringing up the slides?
Yep.
All right, thank you. So my brief presentation will focus on a post-COVID Somalia, particularly the education sector. Are we ready for the schools to reopen? And if so, what needs to be done? Briefly, if you can go to the next slide, please. It's a three-part presentation. Ayaan, next slide, please.
Can you see? Next slide.
Yes, I can see. Thank you. So okay. There's been a lot of talk around why are schools reopening now? There's a lot of talk about going back to school, and the pandemic has not flatlined, if you may. So why the discussion around reopening schools now? There's a lot, with the school closure, there's a lot of disruption to the instructional learning time that learners have been having. And so it can have a long-term impact on the child's ability to learn. On average, the contact hours for a primary school child is 5 hours. This is not happening right now when schools are closed, even though they are accessing education, but to an extent, the instructional time is really affected. So having them going back to school will help solve that because we're looking at the quality aspect of education. Marginalized children are out of school even before the pandemic. We had, as per cluster statistics, we had 2 million children out of school. So the children who are marginalized are less likely to return. Okay, children from poorest households will almost not come back to school when they resume. So it's important that schools are opened as soon as possible, just to ensure that this particular constituency of children are still able to go back to school. Being out of school, as Fuong mentioned, it increases the risk of a number of issues: teenage pregnancies, sexual exploitation, child marriage, child labor, violence, and many other threats. And as a result, it adds a lot of stress and depression. And there's a lot of limited coping mechanisms, which ordinarily will be available at school level, all right? Further, you'll find prolonged closures will disrupt essential services which are normally found in schools. In particular, and very importantly, school feeding. There's a lot of support at school on mental health and psychosocial support. And as a result, this can cause stress and anxiety due to the loss of peer interaction at school level and also because of disrupted routines for the learners. And you do realize that these negative impacts will be significantly higher for marginalized children. I'm referring to IDPs, returnees, refugees, girls, children living with disabilities, but not limited to that. But those are like the key people who will be affected. And so when the schools begin to reopen, the priority should be, number one, on reintegrating children into the school setting, but importantly, very safely, and in ways that will allow learning to pick up again. Very importantly, again, learning. Because it's one thing to have the children in school, it's another thing to have them learning, okay? And this is especially the case for those who will have suffered the biggest learning losses. All right, so we will need to ensure, even though we are opening, it needs to be very equitable, okay? And so for the reopening to happen, schools will need to be logistically prepared. And like Fuong mentioned, the teaching workforce has to be ready for that. All right, next slide, please. So what are the key considerations that need to be put into account when schools are reopening? The first one is policy reform. And this has already been done. I believe everyone has seen the school reopening guidelines from the ministry. So it's very important that these policies are in place for school reopening. I've seen a question in the questions box about there being possibly a second wave. Remember, the pandemic is not unique to Somalia. So what happens in the event there's a second wave of the pandemic? Are there any plans or policies in place to deal with this? Are schools going to close again? So there's a lot of reform needed to expand equitable access to education and also standardize the remote learning practices that Pfizer was talking about. Because you'll find that the pylon effect of the pandemic is that it's likely that interruptions to education can have a very long-term implication, particularly for the vulnerable learners. And we stand a real risk of regression for children whose basic foundational learning, talking about numeracy, literacy, was not very strong. So that category of children who initially, even before the pandemic, didn't have that strong foundation, there's a real risk of them regressing even further. All right. So it's very important that we have this in mind. There's a lot of financing requirements needed for schools to be reopened, addressing the impact of the pandemic and investing in particularly strengthening education systems, looking around recovery and resilience. All right. A lot of work around safe operations, ensuring that conditions that will reduce the chances of disease transmission, also safeguarding essential services at school level, and promoting healthy behavior at school. The standard supply of soap and clean water for safe hand washing, all these procedures, so that when the staff and the learners are in school, they need to feel safe and protected. Remember, we are talking about compensating learning. Not all children are able to access the distance learning right now. So we will need to focus a lot on practices that compensate for the lost instruction time. I will need a lot of strengthening pedagogy and possibly build on hybrid learning models. For example, integrating what is currently ongoing, the remote and distance learning with the standard education pathway. So all that will need to be considered. Of course, a lot of work around disease transmission and prevention as well. There's a lot of work that's needed around wellness and protection. So we will really need to do a lot of work around well-being and reinforcing the protection of children. And this is through enhancing referral mechanisms and the provision of essential school-based healthcare and referral systems. And of course, very importantly, psychosocial support and school feeding. It's important that as we plan to open the schools, we need to ensure that we will reach the most marginalized out-of-school children that I mentioned had not been reached even prior to the pandemic. All right, next slide, please. So who should be our priority? This is by no means exhaustive, but the priority during the back to school should definitely be girls who are affected in one way or another by the pandemic and need to be targeted for back to school. IDPs, refugees, and returnee children are a big constituency who need to be targeted. Children with disabilities. During this time, there are a lot of children affected by trauma and mental health issues. There has to be deliberate activities targeting these children. Not all children are able to access technology, particularly those in rural areas, and pastoralist children. Those should be like the main target for us. And finally, are schools ready for reopening? Brings me back to my question. What are the basic principles that we need to ensure that the schools are ready for reopening? Of course, the main ones are of course, ensuring that the school needs to start enforcing regular hand washing with safe water and soap. Minimum daily disinfection and cleaning of school surfaces. All schools as a minimum should have running water, sanitation and waste management facilities, and follow environmental cleaning and decontamination procedures. Of course, it's important that any learners or teachers or staff who are exhibiting symptoms should not come to school. They should remain until they are better. And then very importantly, I know this has come up so many times, the question about social distancing. How will this be practical in our setting? Because particularly for urban schools, some schools have upwards of 60, 70 learners in a class. So realistically, how are we going to ensure social distancing for such schools? And there's a lot of discussion around that globally, not necessarily for our context, but there are different approaches being considered. For example, staggering the start and close day of the school day, so just having it staggered. The meal times for schools which offer school feeding, just staggering that as well. There's talk around moving classes to temporary spaces or even having some classes outdoors. There's talk around having the schools being done in shifts to reduce the class size so that you have a small class size. And then, of course, there's the talk around considering other alternative education pathways, not necessarily coming to school. There is the distance learning, for example. There is the online learning. Of course, cancelling assemblies and sports games and other events, which create crowded conditions. And of course, very importantly, ensuring that children's desks are at least 1 meter apart, okay? And it's important that schools, once they begin to reopen, the priority for all of us should be to reintegrate children into the school setting very safely and in ways that will allow learning to start up again, all right? So to answer the question is, this is not something that is done, it's not a silver bullet, but it's something that is very gradual, but at least schools are beginning to start setting this up in place. Of course, it's a team effort. Humanitarians have to come in, the government has to come in, donors have to come in, just to make sure that the schools are ready to go back. But it's a number of activities that need to be implemented between now and when schools reopen, but definitely schools are working on that. So it's for all of us to come and try support where we can to ensure that all these measures are put in place prior to the schools reopening. So thank you. I will leave it there for now.
Thank you so much, Sam. I think that was a great way to see if we are actually ready for the reopening of schools and how post-COVID will look like for children in Somalia, and those in education setting and those also in the remote areas. So I hope the technical problem has been solved with the children. So now, before I go to the children, please know that we will have the next 30 minutes to finalize the meeting. So if you have a question, please put in the chat box and we will try to cover as much as we can. But with the time, you know, we will not be able to cover much. Please put all your questions in the chat box. So now I give you Halima, who will speak about, you know, on the behalf of the children and basically to hear from what they have to say. They are the ones that we need to be listening and prioritizing their views, where we also work with them to ensure that the education continues. Halima, mana maqlaysaa? Halima. Halima, mana maqlaysaa?
Hello, Ayan, are you able to hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you very well.
Okay, excellent. So Sharmaki is going to go first. I'm going to pass you to Sharmaki. Sorry, we had an issue with the technical issue, but there won't be any video, but as long as you can hear Sharmaki. So Sharmaki,
Yeah.
please.
Yeah, no problem. Sharmaka, soo dhawow.
waan dhowahay inta barnaamijkan ku jirta waan salaamayaa iyo mahadcelin kaas ahaan aada Save the Children ka wakiilna carruurta Soomaaliyeed. Qodobada aan ka hadli doono waxaa ka mid ah COVID-19 saameynta uu ku yeeshtay carruurta Soomaaliyeed. Carruurta Soomaaliyeed waxa uu ku reebay cudurkan safmareenka ah inuu carruur badan baabi'iyey si caafimaad darro ah ayagoo aan lahayn awooddii difaaca. Carruurta Soomaaliyeed kuwa waxbarashada dhigta iyo kuwa dugsiyada Qur'aanka dhigtaba waxa uu ku reebay dib u dhac xooggan xagga waxbarashada, daruustii oo aan dhammaystirnayn iyo heerka waxbarasho ay ka gaari lahaayeen iyo hamigii ay u lahaayeen inay u fadhiistaan imtixaanaadka sanad dugsiyeedka in uu ka habsaamay. Carruurta Soomaaliyeed waxa uu ku riday farxad la'aan taasoo la shaki geliyey in aysan isla imaanin goobihii ay ku ciyaari jireen ayagoo isjecel. Carruurta Soomaaliyeed si gaar ah oo aan loola tashan ama ra'yigooda lagu darsan si ay uga qayb qaataan wacyigelinta cudurka safmareenka ah. Iskuullada sidii loo xiray ayay weli u xiran yihiin. Wax warcad ahna kama soo bixin. Online-na kuma qaadano cashirka sida raadiyaha iyo meediyaha. Haddii ay lacala dhici lahayd in aan ku qaadano online, carruur aan haysanin in ay ama ay gaari karin in ay online ka qaataan ama sida raadiyaha ama meediyaha. Marka intaasoo dhan oo saameyn ugu yeeshtay cudurkan.
Aad baad u mahadsan tahay Sharmake. Halima ku xigtaan filaya mise?
Yes, Ayan, before we go to Halima, do you want to summarize for the non-Somali speakers that we have online?
Yes, I will summarize one time. Halima, soo daa.
Okay.
Right.
السلام عليكم.
عليكم السلام.
اوكي bilaabi karaa malena.
ha Halima waad bilaabi kartaa. Haye noo sheeg. Maxaad maanta doontaa inaad nala wadaagto?
Waxaan doonayaa inaan idinla wadaago impact of coronavirus of the children of Somalia.
Waaye.
Okay, saameynta COVID-19 aad ayay u badan tahay. Saameynta oo carruurta Soomaalida u geysta aad ayay u fara badan tahay, balse lama soo koobi karo. Midda caqabada ugu weyn waa uu sababay coronaviruska waxaa ka mid ah xiritaanka iskuulka. Xiritaanka iskuulka ayaa ah caqabada ugu weyn oo uu sababay coronavirus. Taasina waxay sababtay in carruur badan ay niyad jab ku dhacdo oo ay ka niyad jabaan waxbarashada.
waayahay
maxaa yeelay waxaa jiray caruur badan oo iskuullada ka cunteyn jiray qado iyo quraac oona ku xirnaa iskuullada
waayahay
okay meeshana waxaa ka baxay markii oo iskuulka la dhahay waa la xiraa xataa la ogeyn xilligii la furaayo oo ciyaalkii loo fasaxay iyaga oo aan ogeyn xilligii iskuulka la furaayo iyo xilligii kale meeshana ciyaalka waxay aaminsanaayeen inuu ahaa amni iskuulka waxay aaminsanaayeen ciyaalka inuu ahaa amni amnigaasoo xataa mararka qaar oo guryahooda iyo iyagoo iskuulka xiran yahay iyagoo iskuulka xiran yahay oo imaanaya iskuulka
waayahay
dhanka iyo maxaa la dhahayay gabdhaha xiritaanka horta iskuulka ama cudurkan coronaviruska saameynta weyn oo Soomaali ahaan iyo aniga ahaanba oo nagu sababay waxaa ka mid ah in maxaa la dhahayay caruurta iyo waalidkooda ay iska hor imaadaan maxaa yeelay waxaa jirta xilli ay iskuulka aadaan iyo xilli dugsi ay aadaan iyo xilli guriga ay joogaan balse hadda waxay noqotay in iskuullada la xiro oo noqdo maxaa la dhahayay iskuul dugsi iyo waalidka in ay caruurta ku noqnoqdaan labadaas meel inay ku noqnoqdaan taasina waxay sababtay in maxaa la dhahayay caruurta iyo waalidka ay iska hor imaadaan iska hor imaatankaasna waxaa maxaa la dhahayay ugu daran wiilasha waa ay bixi karaan oo way baashaal way aadi karaan balse gabdhaha lagama yaabo inay banaan u baxaan ama sharciga maba dhigaya inay gabdho banaanka aadaan marka waxaa imaanaysaa in waalidka iyo gabdhihii ay noqdaan kuwo maxaa la dhahayay mar walba iska hor imaada kuwo mar walba indhaha isku dhufta taasina waxay sababaysaa in gabadhi loo diro shaqo oo la dhaho soo shaqeey guriga ha ii fadhin waxbarashada way xiran tahay oo walba waalidka waxbarashada uusan ku qanacsanaynin haddana waxaa jirta in la dhaho gabadha guur degdeg ah in loo keeno oo aan xataa go'aankeeda la weydiinaynin oo inaan la dhehayna maku qanacsan tahay guurkaasoo xatana waalidka ma ahan inuu dhahaayo wiilaa kuu keenaye maxaa ka qabtaa ma ahan laakiin waa guursanaysaa go'aan kama dambeys ah oo la dhahaayo fardaco iyo far hawaar taasina aniga ayaa igu dhacda
haye xalimo soco
aniga ayaa igu dhacdayba anigana maxaa la dhahayay waa hooyo waxay yidhaahday iskuulka wuu xiran yahay meeshaan fadhi male awal bareefadan dhigi jiray bareefadkiina wuu xirmay coronaviruska daraadiisa waxay dhahday marka walaale miya ahaa waqtigaa nagu socdee waxbarashada inaa iska joojisid ee guurso ee idhahdaba waaba la ii keenaba wiilkana waa wiil cidda ah marka kadib waxaan yeelay adiga hal isbuucaba maskaxday dhammaan way maqneed bo adi ina maxaa la dhahay guri jooga iyo in kaleba waaba kala ogaan waayaba xataa markii dambe ayaa waxaa yeelay maamulka iskuulka u sheegay ilaan asiga ah midka igu dhow haddii iskuul la dhaho gurigana laga yaabo marmar inaa hooya waxaa u sheegta balse hadda iyadaaba amarka kasoo bax maahan maamulka iskuulkan u sheegay maamulka iskuulkana wuxuu wacay waalidka ayuu ka dhaadhiciyey wax walba jiro marka dib ayay iskugu laabatay hadda alxamdulilah ilaaha ku mahadina oo dib ayay u noqotay
alxamdulilah wax kale miyaad doonaysaa inaad kala wadaagto
wallahi dhibaatooyinka maxaa la dhahaya hadda ka jira Soomaaliya lama soo koobi karo wax badan inaan ka sheego waa rabay balse waxaan dhihi lahaa in guurka degdeg ah iyo waxyaabahaas oo dhan wacyigelin loo sameeyo
si fiican baan ku maqlaynaa xalimo aad iyo aad baad u mahadsan tahay adiga iyo sharmaaka inaad noo timaadaan oo nala sheekaysataan maanta kulankana aad nagala soo qayb qaadataan aad iyo aad baan idinka mahad celinaya so now I'm going to try to translate what Sharmaka and Halima said for our non-Somali speaking colleagues. So Halimo, and I will go to Sharmaka. What he said is actually coronavirus has a big impact on children, especially on health and also school closure. Because children in Somalia go both formal school and also to the madrasas for Quranic schools. And these platforms serve a place where children are able to be themselves, place they can play, place they can feel safe from whatever is happening outside of the environment and the context they are living. Two powerful takeaways I got from Sharmaki is that schools are closed. the children do not have information on when the schools will be open, how will they open. You know, there's no basically feedback to the children, and also there's no opportunity for children to take part in the awareness raising campaigns on against the coronavirus, and children are not consulted enough when it comes to this, the coronavirus and whatever plan is that is taking place at the national level. That was really two great takeaways from Sharmake. Halimo, by the way, has actually been shared very moving story of how coronavirus has, the school closures due to coronavirus has impacted her life basically as a child. So Halim said, due to schools a safer place where children go and play, and also a feeding space for children from vulnerable families. And when schools are closed, children do not, don't have a place to go, and also a place to feel safe from, the different violations that I think all our panelists have just mentioned. Our, their presentation on sexual violence and child marriage and all that violations that are happening to the children. And also she talked about the school serving to be a safe space where they feel safe. And also she talked about how children feel discouraged that schools are closed. Now then what? In especially for girls, what does that mean? They are not able to go out. Boys are always able to go out and play, but the girls do not go out. So that means it's another obstacle added to whatever inequalities that is already existing for girls. And also Halima talked about the schools are closed, and it means for girls to get married. There's nothing else to do, so now it's time for them to actually get married. And mothers are finding a motive to push for girls to get married. Halima has just shared a story about herself when her mother told her, there's no private school you're going, there's no school, there's no education. That means you are getting married. And she found a man for her, and she actually pushed her to get married. But Halima had the opportunity to go to her school management and told them about what is happening. And the school management actually spoke to her mother and stopped the marriage. But she said many girls are not fortunate like her, to have someone stopping that kind of, happening in their lives. So it means school closure means a big thing for children. And for children not knowing when are they going back to school is also another obstacles. Basically what she's saying is that we adults are not speaking to the children to give them a concrete information on that ensures them that everything is going to be right and their life is going back to normal. Or we're not, there's no that assurance of them feeling, their education will continue. So I think that's a very powerful message for all of us working in the education sector, whether with the government or with the international UN partners, to actually, and child-focused organizations like UNICEF and ADRA and also Save the Children, areas we need to really look at. That's really moving message, and thank you so much to these children for sharing their voices. And we try to bring the children's voice as much as we can. Now it's time for questions. I think we have received quite a number of questions from the public, and also we have questions for you that we thought would be really relevant to answer. We don't have much time, but I think if we add more 20 minutes to this discussion to ensure we allow everyone the opportunity to ask us the questions. So the first question comes from the public, says, Ahmed Ayala says, government has announced to lift all restrictions since the pandemic is still visible. Schools will open in 1 August. I think that's in Somaliland. Since there's no precaution measures in place, how can we make sure that education facilities, private schools and madrasas apply the mitigation missions in school, and how can we support the institutions to the government and also these schools to ensure safety. I think that goes back to Sam. This is about going back to school. Sam, would you like to address that question?
Yes, definitely. Thank you. Thank you for that question. And maybe something that I can point out. This is something that's been discussed at different levels, because there's a lot of questions coming around that. How will schools go back, and what will need to be done for them to go back? And we need to start working from this as the new normal. Okay. And so there's no silver bullet. There's no single solution. It's going to be different solutions depending on the context. And that's why I spoke about one discussion is staggering the start and close of the school day, staggering of meal times. In some instances, there's been discussions around allowing only upper grade learners to report first, and then after a couple of months, allowing the lower grade learners to report. Okay. There's been discussions around having the schools in shifts, and also distance learning pathways. So again, it's different models are being explored by the authorities, by the ministries, and for us as partners, it's just to also see what can work for our context and what cannot work. But it's on a case by case, it's on a region by region, but it's something that definitely does not have one silver bullet. It's different approaches for different contexts. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think my second question goes to this phone. But the question is, does Somalia have a necessary required infrastructure, also human resources and a technical capacity, to implement and also innovate new learning, pathways to minimize the impact and disruption of education?
Yes, thank you very much for that. I think in Somalia, we have very strong ministries of education with very good cooperative partners. I think this is, the situation here is quite different from anything that's been experienced. But the education authorities, together with support from donors and partners, UNICEF, Save the Children, ADRA, we're looking at different modalities so that we can reach children with education and learning opportunities. I think we discussed the different modalities, anything from print to radio, WhatsApp, internet, and so forth. And I think a lot of work is being rolled out right now. I think the challenge for us in terms of the learning itself, first is providing distance learning and the different modalities, but I think it's also important, and one of the colleagues in the chat room here mentioned, is that we also need to support the parents to prioritize providing this type of support to their children. So if there's only one radio in the household, if there's only one TV or one mobile phone, we really need to work with parents and caregivers to also help to prioritize this type of learning for children while the schools are still closed. Coming back to school, we also need to make sure that we are providing children with the necessary psychosocial support. Because if children are distressed and they're not in the right frame of mind to go back to school, then they're less likely to return to school. I think I just want to end with 3 key points in terms of the reopening of school, is that we need to have a key laser focus on reaching the most marginalized children. These are the really rural, marginalized, out of school, in school, whatever. Children with disabilities, we really have to have laser focus on that. We also need to make sure that in terms of the learning outcome, I know this is perhaps controversial that we want to stick to the curriculum, but I think we need to have a broader picture to focus on the learning outcomes of children and not only trying to cover the missing part of the curriculum. Are they learning? I think we need to focus on that. And then finally, the third area that we need to focus on is really about providing a holistic support to children. And that again comes back to the nutritious feeding, to the water, to the sanitation services for girls and for boys, the psychosocial support. So I think we have an opportunity to actually improve even more on what we have due to this COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Juan. And I think this other question goes to Dr. Faiza is, what has been the most challenging issues in adapting new ways of working and also delivering education to the children in hard to reach areas, especially in a rural areas? I think that's the question of concern that a lot of people are asking themselves. How can we reach these children? Faiza, welcome. Dr. Faiza, can you hear me?
Sorry, yes, I was muted. Can you hear me now? I think, like I said, the hardest thing has been that the infrastructure is not there, and the systems were not there. So what is feasible really depends on what exists outside, not just the education sector, but also across the country. So it's, I mean, even before COVID, it was always hard to reach children in rural areas and children in, outside the urban locations. I think that kind of answers the question. The hardest part has been the fact that the infrastructure doesn't exist outside the sector.
Okay. Thank you so much, Faiza. I think we will have time for 2 more questions, then I think we will wrap it up. Because of the time, and it's already prayer times in Somalia. Yeah. So the second question is to Mengistu. Mengistu, what do you think will be what role can a donor and international community play to ensure education continuity in Somalia, particularly looking at the donors who are already responding to COVID-19, including GBE and also ECW? They quite seem to be responsive to the COVID-19 challenge and supporting the education sector. But what do you think will be the greater role for donors, and how can they ensure they support the continuation of education?
In Somalia, to be very frank, the donors had really been very, very supportive, because even if you look from Save the Children point of view, almost all our donors were very flexible, which allowed us also to reprogram all our activities, give us fund for COVID response, and also funding for accelerated funding to support the COVID response activity. In education, I think we are not really there to get all the amount of funds that we require to respond to COVID, but we are not in a very bad situation compared to other countries. The other thing that we really think of the donors is also to give technically also the international organizations, particularly working on education, to technically also support the Ministry of Education, which they have been doing now. I really want to appreciate the Somaliland Ministry of Education for organizing all stakeholders to support them in designing the response plan. And that is one area where international organization can contribute. And the other one is all international organization has to take this COVID problem as a problem of a global problem and start fundraising. Or different direction of fundraising. Save Children, UNICEF, CARE, ADRA, all working on education. We have to take that as one of our major activity in raising funds to respond to this, because COVID is really becoming a very expensive one. When we talk of COVID response, we are not talking about only education, but we are talking about integrated approach, like health issues, protection issues, school feeding issues, and all these issues should be taken as a package, not only the learning aspect of it, but those components that support children's learning and children's protection and children's safety. So the healthy thing, the safety thing, the protection thing, the feeding things should also be a package. That is where we all have to really raise funds for the ministries to respond holistically.
Thank you so much, Mengistu. I think this will be how we're going to wrap this discussion. Due to time, we don't have much time to address all your questions, but panelists from this discussion from ADRA, Save the Children, UNICEF, you can always reach out to the organizations and ask whatever questions you have. You can also visit our social media page, all these organizations, and we will be able to respond to you whatever questions you have from our end. I'm ending this to ask all the four panelists to, and also our four panelists to actually give us one or two key, a very, very strong recommendation to the government and also to wider education sector. And we need to consider at this moment, what do we need to do to ensure that children continue learning across Somalia? So I mean, I will go first, then I will give to Mrs. Fawn, and then Faisa, then Sam, then we're going to close the meeting. So Mingista, welcome.
The COVID pandemic is really new to us, and it has also created a new environment, a new atmosphere, and a new way of working. So one thing I advise ourselves is that let's get out of the traditional way of thinking of education, like just classroom attention, only the classroom instruction things, but see education in holistic, in supporting children's right to health, right to protection, right to feeding, which all contribute to better learning. And since we all know the capacity of the Ministry of Education in Somali and Somaliland, we also have to take our role seriously and start raising fund as well as support the ministry technically to respond to this COVID pandemic, as it is really a global crisis. This is not something that we leave to a certain ministry or a certain organization. That is one. The second one is also messaging for the community, so that the community will also be ready to support their children, understand the online and TV, radio, all these platforms. As they are new and as we have no experience on these things, communities might not be really convinced that their children are really getting education. So community, parents also to support the learning of their children. And the third one is all of us has to do a campaign for go back to safe to school. After closure of schools for 3 months, the possibility of dropping, not coming back to school is very, very likely. So all campaigns, all advocacy work we have to do with government, with communities, with religious leaders and community elders to really help support children to get back to school once the schools are open. Thank you, Jan.
Thank you so much, Mingister. Mrs. Fon?
Yes, thank you very much. And further to the points I mentioned earlier, I think, it's important that we prepare, the children, the communities, and the school, so that everyone is aligned and the type of messages. So you don't just say, schools are reopened and everyone comes. You have to actually prepare for that. Weeks in advance, months in advance, if ever possible, to make sure that there's water and sanitation, that there's enough space in the classroom. So the schools have to be prepared, but the children and the communities also need to be prepared to come back to school. I think in terms of advocacy at a higher level, we need to advocate with the government to make sure that we continuously provide funding for education, so that we don't look at only the immediate needs, but really plan on the medium and longer term needs of the education sector. I think that's also very important. And this is an opportunity, absolutely, to build the education system better than what it was before. We are taking a hit back, but I think there's an opportunity, absolutely, to move forward, to bring more children into school through other learning modalities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Faisa?
Thank you, Ayan. My colleagues Mengistu and Fung have already captured most of it. There's nothing much to add from my side other than to say, this in the physical provision of education to distance learning options is a long-term investment, and it gives us future opportunities to reach children that are out of school. And the government of Somalia now has the opportunity to build more flexible education systems that last beyond this crisis. So that's it, really. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And finally, Sam.
All right, thank you, Ayan. Just touching on from what Faiza has said, now that we are moving to distance education, I think we need to make sure that we now start doing long-term planning and building of these distance education systems. I think one lesson we've learned from this COVID-19 emergency is distance education is a must-have. We should not look at it separately from the other education pathways. I think moving forward, it should be a must-have. It should be integrated into the essential component of the overall education system of Somalia. So I think that's something we need to start moving forward. Let it be a must-have for our education system in Somalia. Let us try our best to limit the learning poverty indicator. I know the pandemic is really going to affect learning outcomes, but let's try our best to limit that indicator. Let it remain, or let us improve on it. And finally, reintegrating those particular children who are most affected. The laser targeting that Fuong spoke about, that should be our key target when we are planning to reopen the schools. Let us have a special lens for those particular category of learners who were already affected even before the pandemic. That should be my closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam, and all the panelists. I think there's two key takeaways from me. Is that if you would like to receive the presentation and also our upcoming dialogues and discussions, or you have a topic you would like us to cover, please leave your email in the chat box, and we'll be able to contact you. We invited today all these panelists to actually make sure that the public has the attention of the impact coronavirus has on education. Please tweet, share on social media, whatever reflection you got it from our great panelists today talking to us about the impact of COVID-19 on education, and also the great children who came to talk to us today. I think that was really powerful, and every one of you felt the way I felt, as most of the people who were in the call are Somali speaking people. So please make sure that you leave your email in the chat box, so we will contact you and also update our upcoming webinars. And I would like to thank you so much for coming to us and attending this important meeting. Please share it with your family, with your community, with all the people that's around you, to ensure that the impact of COVID-19 on children's education is visible, and we all take the necessary the steps to ensure that children continue learning. Please, thank you so much. I'm going to wrap this meeting by thanking you all for attending, and until we come back to our next webinar, that's all from me. And thank you so much, UNICEF Somalia, especially Mrs. Fong, coming to us, being our great panelist. And also I would like to thank Advocacy Somalia and also my colleagues from Save the Children, Mengistu and Dr. Faisa, coming to talk to us. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Until we talk the next time, I tell you goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you all. Goodbye. Have a good day.
Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good day. Bye.